to what you can get with a VAT, which does not hurt industry. And what really surprises me is that those people and those groups who would benefit from the VAT are opposed to it. So it must be that it has been sold incorrectly, or that the people who want to administer it really do not want to administer it. So basically, if we can get the additional 3% of GDP, that's an additional 1.5% of GDP for provinces out of the divisible pool. And then I'll come back to some options of how to handle provincial assignments in the next lecture. No, the Prophet said, go to China if you want knowledge. And I think he was referring to the value-added tax. And, you know, people should look at what the Chinese have done. In 1992, the Chinese were in trouble. The tax GDP ratio had fallen from 25% to 12% because it moved from a socialist administration to a market system. They did not have a central tax administration, so decided to put in a central tax administration and collect the value-added tax. This is Socialist People's Republic of China. Brought in a value-added tax in 1992, and it saved their bacon. The value-added tax in China, which is still not a complete value-added tax, generates 9% of GDP. The Chinese tax GDP ratio is up to 20%. It's still not enough for them because they plan to be a world power. They want 30% of GDP. But additional revenues they know will come from the personal income tax. And they have reduced the corporate income tax rate to 35%, from 35% to 25% and made it standardized for everybody. All firms are treated equally now at a 25% corporate tax rate. So proposals that I hear now in Pakistan that the corporate income tax is going to be raised to 45% is going completely against the grain of international experience. And really should be reconsidered, because the last thing you want is to kill the goose that lays the golden egg for supposedly for equity purposes. Where is the equity in this? This is the incidence of the corporate income tax is not necessarily individuals. This is the Chinese case. You had a decline. The red line is the decline in the tax GDP ratio, and the dotted line is a share of the central government in total revenues. The central government share, which had gone down from around 45 to 55% to around 20% by 1992. And the decline in GDP, tax GDP ratio, you can see from 1992. But look at what happened when they introduced the VAT in 1994. With the new tax administration, they brought in 2 years, they brought in the new administration, put in a VAT. The central government share shot up back to where it should have been, to 55% of revenues. And the total tax GDP ratio began its upward trend and saved them from the macro disintegration that they feared would happen when they looked at the Soviet Union. And Zhou Rongji paid us a compliment because we worked with the Chinese at this period. And he said that this was one of the most important reforms that the Chinese government has put in place to put their public finances on a firm footing. And what's interesting with the Chinese is they've thought through the political economy. What happens to the provinces? What happens to households? Do not for a moment think that there was a minute that Zhou Rongji or anybody in China said, no, we can't have the VAT because it hurts the poor. That it never occurred. Because they have instruments to protect the poor. We have instruments to protect the poor. Why don't we use them efficiently? Why do we want the value-added tax to do everything? Why do we think that the value-added tax is going to hurt the poor in the first place? Go to China, young man, as the Prophet might have said. Are we facing a crisis now? And I think this is really very, very important. In 2000, we were at the top of the queue. IMF had been through a lean period. There were not many takers for the IMF money. They were worried that the IMF would become redundant. And all of a sudden, here comes Pakistan and said, Bismillah, here's $8 billion. And then we went back for another $3.5 billion, and I'll come back why that was a mistake. Now, it's different. Now you have Greece in trouble. You have Ireland in trouble, Portugal in trouble, Spain in trouble, Italy perhaps, all requiring massive amounts of resources and major restructuring needs. You're talking about 5 to 10% of GDP adjustment in each of these cases. How can the IMF come to take the case of Pakistan and say, oh, you promised to do a VAT, well, you don't want to do it, well, okay, no man, don't forget it. Here's, just keep your $8 billion. It's just not going to happen. It's a different IMF. And you're talking about countries with tax GDP ratios in 30% and more. And we are at 10. And 30% and they're in trouble. So at 35%, they're asking Ireland to make a 5% of GDP adjustment. हम क्या बात कर रहे हैं? We have not been able to budge a tax GDP ratio from when we made the promise. It's just stayed constant, in spite of the carbon tax which Shaukat Tareen brought in. But that was a substitute for the carbon, the petroleum levy. So not really in addition to revenues. It's a change in nomenclature. It's called a tax revenue. So no effective increase in revenues during this period. We had promised 1% a year. Nahi hua. So that's what it looks like for the countries in trouble. Greece, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, they're the ones in trouble. New Zealand, UK. They're up to 40%, some of them. Tax revenue, tax to GDP revenue. Norway is almost 60%. हम किस मुंह से कहते हैं कि हम 10% से नहीं बढ़ाना चाहते या कम करना चाहते हैं? हिमाकत है। और कहते हैं कि प्रॉब्लम नहीं है जी, हमारे रिजर्व्स बहुत बढ़ गए हैं। किसके रिजर्व्स हैं? आपके तो नहीं है बाबा। These reserves belong to the IMF and other central banks that have parked money in our central bank. फिर कहते remittances बहुत बढ़ गई हैं। भाई, in 2008 the issue was whether remittances would fall because the workers were coming back. And then they rose and we said, well, maybe this is because workers are coming back, they're remitting their savings. But it continued to go up with fewer workers. ये कैसे? सोचें तो जरा। और कोई बढ़ी है तादाद वर्कर्स की? नहीं बढ़ी तो नहीं है, वही वर्कर्स है। ये पैसे कैसे आ रहे हैं? अब सोचो जरा, एक phenomenon है, उसको कहते हैं carry trade, where people, firms, speculators borrow in low interest environments, and rest of the world is low interest environments, 0%, and park it in high interest environments. Pakistan 15-16% without any difficulty. Put in the stock market, it's tax free. Put it in real estate, it's tax free. Turn it around, double your money, take it out. Or just leave it in a bank, 15%. So the question is whether this is carry trade. What I would suggest is somebody needs to do some work. And that somebody should be the researchers and the State Bank. And this is something that LUMS or ideas, PID, should be looking at. What are the components of remittances? Who are the people? What are they remitting? Where is the money going? Where is the money coming from? How is it being used? How is it being taken out? If it is carry trade, then that's hot money. And what we are doing with our profligate government spending is we are financing the speculators of the world. And the moment the IMF program is seen to be dead, it's been dead since last May, it's just obituary hasn't been issued. It's been dead since last May. And people realize that. and the exchange rate begins to move. You remember the exchange rate's been fixed. And people realize what these reserves are. It's worse now than in 2007. There are no reserves, very few reserves. Then the fall can be quite steep. And unlike in 2008 or 2007, 2008, there's no easy IMF lifeboat. Next time the IMF are in town, come for another program, it's not going to be this easy, paise le le, phir baad mein dekhenge. There will be a lot of prior conditions. My good friend Zubair Khan will know from experience. Ye dekhen, this is the these are the numbers. The red lines are highest ever. The first highest ever reserves was 14 billion in the IMF definition. These are IMF definitions, not Pakistani definitions. Of which there was a remaining 1.5 billion belonging to the IMF, and the rupee was 60 rupees. And they had kept the rupee overvalued and stable. This was Shaukat Aziz's mistake. What have we managed to do since 2008? We've again fixed the rupee. It's stable, it's fixed, pretty much. Fluctuates a little bit, up and down, largely up. Look at the highest reserves, 14.25. 14,285,000,000 under IMF definition. This is the State Bank foreign exchange holder. But look at the next column. How much do we owe the IMF? 9 billion. You have to start paying that back next year. So देखें कितने reserves हैं, cushion कितना है आपके पास. And why would you want to go back for another tranche of another 3.5 billion to stick in reserves that you are not going to be able to repay? So this is a bit of a problem. Reserves are similar, but commodity prices are also worsening now. $100 a barrel. In 2008, we had the promise of tax reforms. 2011, we tried the tax reforms and they failed. 2011, you've got political deadlock. 2011, no easy access to IMF. 2011, our credibility is in tatters. We are termed liars to our face. Cheats and liars are what we are called. We don't know how much hot money has flown in that we are financing through these high interest rates. I would say we are more vulnerable now than we were in 2007. And all this story you hear every day or every second day, reserves are the highest they've ever been, is not doing anybody a service, because it deflects attention from the real problem and it recreates the sense of false security that Musharraf had, which led to the mistaken policy agenda that they led to collapse at that time. If somebody does a proper debt sustainability analysis, now let me come back to the issue of the tax reform. I'm sorry I'm taking more time than you have allocated, but I think it's important. Question is, they keep saying, we can't do it. Parliament won't let us. So the question is, will not or cannot? I think it's a bit of both, because there are things they could have done without going to Parliament, and they haven't. So what is it that we promised? We promised 4 to 5% of GDP in 5 years. We promised VAT plus. You can't do just 5% of VAT, GDP just with the VAT. So the idea was that you would have most of it coming from the VAT, but also with the VAT you get improvements in the income tax. You get information flows, arm's length administration, you generate more revenues from the income tax. So the linkage between the VAT and the income tax was always there. So it was not just a VAT reform, it was a VAT and income tax reform.